When I left fundamentalist Christianity and religion in general, I took a lot of classes online, and I've been in therapy for 3 years. Therapy is a vital part about accepting, noticing, and experiencing resolution when it comes to fighting against and acknowledging trauma. Not all trauma looks the same. I had 4 siblings who are up to 15 years older than me. I'm the youngest of 5 kids. Some of my siblings have similar issues, while 2 of my siblings seem to have little to no trauma because of the experiences we shared, which is a perfectly viable way of life. Just because someone experiences trauma doesn't mean their nervous system reacts to it as though it was trauma. And in some ways, I'm glad for them that they don't have to endure, experience, or deal with the day-to-day issues surrounding abuse. Not all abuse is physical, emotional, sexual. Some of it's spiritual. And I was learning in the last year about financial abuse. Financial abuse is one of the most egregious abuses that happens, especially in domestic lives, marriage, between seniors and kids. It's very, very possible and very common, especially when one person has financial and legal guardianship or a partnership. Financial abuse is traditionally and most commonly something a man does to a woman, especially in heteronormative relationships where a man is supposed to be the provider and the woman is supposed to be the arm candy, is the nice way of saying it. And that's not the only kind of financial abuse that can happen. Adult kids can financially abuse their elders, especially if the elder is in a nursing home or relies on a guardian. This can be for adult kids as well. Adults who are under the guardianship of guardians, such as a court-appointed POA, a family member, somebody who has legal and financial control over someone. Financial abuse is a very egregious way that men especially have control over women, or somebody has legal or familial power over another person. I grew up in an environment where there was extreme financial control. My parents believed that regardless of your age, if you were a dependent on their taxes, you could be 27 years old, living at home, and still be under complete control of your parents. And yeah, my parents financially controlled everybody. And age had no meaning in my family. On your 18th birthday, you were as financially, legally, and emotionally controlled as you were when you were 12. If you did not have your own separate residence where you were independent in every meaning of the word, you were still considered a child. There was no autonomy in my house. In my parents' house, there was no autonomy. They controlled what you wore, the words you said, what you believed, your own thoughts. And if you were rebellious or exercised a little bit of autonomy, even though nobody in my family had a clue what that was, if you thought or did anything outside of my parents' rigorous ritualistic rules and religious expectations, you would take it to your grave. Any deviation from that experience of what was expected of you us to be different, special, to look at different beliefs as not just different, but with merit. Anything that wasn't under Christianity, a specific type of Christianity. And yes, there are 40,000 Christian denominations, and you could be as Christian as you wanted to. But if you weren't a very specific, very narrow-minded, very white version of Christianity, you were a threat. My family was Baptist for many years, and you could be Episcopalian, and my parents believed it wasn't good enough. You could be Baptist, and you weren't good enough. And when I was between the ages of 18 and 22, which would have been in the early 2010s, my brother got into Calvinism, which is the darkest form of Christianity imaginable. Calvinism follows the TULIP acronym. You can Google it. I made a video a few months ago about it. Basically, they believe in total depravity. There's nothing good about anyone. That man is basically evil, corrupt. I mean, the darkest corners of Christianity, that's where Calvinism is. And it's ironic that the founder committed genocide and mass martyrdom toward anyone political or religious back in the day that did not agree with him. So it was very politically oriented. And when we became Calvinistic people, and when I say we all became, we didn't have a choice. If you were financially and in any way dependent on my family, you had to get in line and believe anything they believed. And if you didn't or couldn't or wouldn't, you took it to your grave. You did not talk about it. There was no... It's hard to explain it. There was no room for disagreement. If you did not believe 100%, you just didn't say it. It's like the emperor with no clothes. Nobody ever said the emperor didn't have clothes. Being different would be seen as an act of religious terrorism. And if you weren't as enthusiastic or just didn't give a damn about whatever my parents would harp on or whatever rabbit they were chasing down, metaphorically speaking, you just didn't say it out loud. You got in line and you did what you were told. And this happened until I was almost 25 years old. My older siblings left home in their mid to late 20s because my parents just wouldn't cut the apron strings. My parents, I was almost 25, and they said, give it 6 months. I mean, half of my 20s are over. What do you mean 6 more months till I leave home? If I'm not ready, whose fault is that? Probably a combination of theirs and mine. But when you're raised in such an environment where you are so brainwashed, whitewashed, controlled, and any education, any training, anything outside the bubble is removed. How can you learn something if you don't know it exists? And it was hard for me to gain employment because my family sabotaged it. I'm not kidding. When I tried to put in paper applications in from 2010 to 2016, my parents would make the applications disappear, or some of my siblings would lie and say they dropped it off and I found it later in their trunk. My family sabotaged my employment and my education. I've made videos where I've talked about growing up and using Abeka homeschooling from Christian fundamentalism in Pensacola, Florida. And if any of you knows anything about academics, Florida is not in the top 30 states with the best education. I mean, Florida is just barely above Oklahoma and Louisiana. The goal is to be in the top 10, not 40 to 50. But when you're raised in an environment where God is the answer to everything, and I never learned evolution because it didn't exist. It was a satanic, anti-God, anti-establishment, anti-patriarchal viewpoint. And it was a threat to everything and everyone. And the sad part about all of it is, when you're raised in an environment where white people are made into victims, I'm not kidding. I did not go one Sunday my entire childhood without hearing that white Christians were being persecuted. If you're a white, cis, heterosexual, Christian man or woman, you belong to at least 4 of the most privileged groups on the planet. The audacity, the utter stupidity and ignorance of a cis, straight, white woman or man saying they're being oppressed, subjugated, persecuted is beyond understanding. And if you're rich, that's a 5th privileged group. And trust me, you don't know rich until you've met white fundamentalist Christians. And I'm not saying that all fundamentalist white Christians are rich, but there's a stereotype, and very few of those people veer off from the stereotype. Racism, too extreme. I can Google Becca books. You can go on YouTube where people who escaped white supremacy, also known as Christian fundamentalism, they would talk about passages in books, Christian textbooks that I used before 2012 that rewrote history, saying that white people were persecuted. And I'm not saying white people have never been persecuted any more than any other group at some point has been targeted. These textbooks made white people out to be the saviors of people they killed. Only a narcissistic group of people could write a textbook that basically makes the white slave owners, the white men who did ethnic cleansing and genocide, only these people could turn around human rights violators and make them the victims. I am not kidding. They would talk about the Trail of Tears in these textbooks like it was the indigenous people's salvation. They died. Losing your homes, being put in places that even to this day is inferior land. Egregious is the only word I can come up with that 100% sums up how I feel about my education. I'm not laughing because it's funny. I cannot believe the stuff I was taught. It astounds me. It is ridiculous. So what can we say about the way our country runs, about Christianity, about everything that goes on? Everything that goes on, really, in our neighborhoods, our homeschooling programs, and what our government does. It's a symptom of a far deeper problem, or it's a product of good conditioning. Anything really good that happens in our country is because of somebody's integrity, hard work, and their inability to give up. Anything bad that happens in our country usually falls under white supremacy, ignorance, stupidity, and bad things happen. They shouldn't, but they do. I grew up in an environment that basically set up the scenario to view anything different as a threat. Anything feminine was viewed as a threat. Anything that was masculine was good, biblical, decent, and worthy of respect. While women, who basically did 80% of all labor, was viewed as though she was a tempting siren. Women in the Bible fell into like 3 categories. The whore, the rare leader, because no other men were available, or somebody that needed to be saved. I would say that walked so Disney could run. The idea that women need to be saved, that women need to be controlled, guided, and needed to be under the authority of man, comes right out of the Bible. I don't think there's a religion that views women as fully human, fully autonomous, without the need or identity of a man. That's why any religion or belief system that is not centered, created, and maintained by women, anything else I view as a threat. The reason why women just aren't valued like men are is because those systems were created, continued, and idolize men. That's why Christianity is inherently sexist. It was started by men, it's continued by men, and it's led by men. And sure, there are exceptions, but there really isn't. Any belief system, whether it's an organized religion or a group of people, 9 out of 10 times it's founded, continued, governed, and held together by men of privilege, usually white men. And it's sad, but we really don't learn. We really do not learn as a society. We believe that anything masculine is inherently good, decent, and worthy of respect. You don't get to be in charge because you're a man. You don't get to be in charge because you have a way. You get to be in charge because you're the best person for the job. And if that's an African American man, a Latino woman, so be it. I'm sick and tired of voting for just white men. And if the best man for the job, who cares about minorities, who wants to help queer people maintain dignity and human rights, and if that's a white man, fine. You look at the mayor of New York City. He could pass for a white man. I know he's not specifically that. I think he has some Arab and Muslim background, but he could pass as a white man of privilege. I wish that we had more consistent political candidates that weren't white. White probably makes up 2/3 of politicians, and 1 out of 4 politicians are women. Women should be more in politics and should have more success than they do. We're one of the few world powers in the world that would rather elect adjudicated rapists than a qualified woman of color. I mean, no amount of bungling or mistakes made by anyone is worse than what Trump's doing right now. A chimpanzee could do a better job. The whole problem with our society, a man can commit the worst acts of human depravity and he still will be elected. But But if a woman does something that interferes with archaic gender roles, or she dares to be something but white, she automatically loses about 30% of the likelihood of being elected. Even with the worst human available to run against Harris, he still won. Which is why there's a joke going on out there that you really don't qualify to be president until you have at least one sexual harassment lawsuit against you. So all the people who work for Trump and who have a history of sexual assault, they're most likely now to become president than a decent human being who just wants to help the non-affluent people. And, I mean, at the end of the day, when the majority of people believe in a God, a religion, and a social set of rules that say the more white, the more male you are, the more Christian you are, means you're a decent human being, I mean, you look at our society. 2 out of 3 prison inmates believe in the Christian God, while less than 1% of prison inmates are atheists. And yet, guess who most people would consider to be the least morally sound human being? The atheist, even though there's less than 1% of prison inmates identify as atheists. Atheists are just more morally consistent people. And I say it all the time. If you need a God to make you not act as a rapist or a thief, you are a rapist and a thief. And even if there is a God, that doesn't stop Trump from groping people. If you have to have a made-up mythological person make you afraid enough not to touch women without consent, you are a rapist. And just because you don't touch people doesn't make you a rapist. Anyone who enables, votes for rapists, condone them, explain away their behavior is a rapist adjacent. Predators could do very little if it wasn't for the hundreds of people who protect them, write letters to judges asking for leniency, wives turning a blind eye. That one happens to be the First Lady. Predators could do very little and not very long without the millions of people protecting them. The only thing I hate worse than a predator is enablers. We need leaders in this country that unite people. That's what all the dictators and megalomaniacs in history have in common. Any leader that divides people and doesn't bring people together for a common goal, front, and agenda is a terrorist. Any leader that divides people, us versus them mentality, which is the cornerstone of all religion, Christianity especially, is a terrorist. They are a dictator, a megalomaniac. People like Nero, Constantine, Charles, I think it was it Charles II of Spain during the Spanish Armada? Peter I. These kind of people use religion as a way to profit without sounding like the bad guy. There's a reason why 7% of all wars are religious. Because nothing gets you more money, more power, more prestige, and a longer lasting legacy than using God as a reason to commit genocide and invade a country. And we need to elect people that are more like the common voter than the billionaires that we unfortunately have to look at. Our world would would be a better place if there was nobody making more than $1 million in the world. But growing up in an environment that turned white people into victims, persecuted victims, is an affront to history. On the mass stage of global history, the white man has been the least likely to be a targeted victim. Because the countries after 1500, after AD 1500, I would say 9 out of 10 world powers were white skinned. Europe, and even Rome. White men, 9 out of 10 times in history, were the leaders, the countries that had the most privilege, power, and wealth. The white man has experienced very little persecution. And people will say, well, what about the pilgrims and the people who started the immigration here before the War of Independence? My response is, if you research their ancestors, they're the ones that did all the religious persecution in New England, Salem, Massachusetts. A lot of those places, the people who left Europe due to persecution, they or their ancestors killed people due to religious differences. The persecuted become the persecutors. I mean, look at the Jewish nation. They go from the Holocaust to bombing Gaza. Every victim of a genocide is capable of, in 2 generations or 80 years, to being the persecutors. White people, historically, have experienced very little persecution. And really, any of the persecution the white man experienced, even to this day, is because one white person believes their religion is better than another white person's. You look at Fox's Book of Martyrs. Most of those people were white people. The only time white people are usually targeted is by religious extremists. It's not enough to believe in the same God. You have to believe everything about their God they want you to believe. You can be Catholic, and they'll still kill each other. Because it's a difference between whether the cracker turns into a real body or not. I think it's called transubstantiation. They will kill each other over having one difference of opinion. That's religion. It's not enough to believe in their God. You have to believe everything about their God. And if the thing you don't believe in is something that they deem a hill they have to die on, they'll kill you over it. That's why countries that are in the Middle East, why they kill women for honor killings. Nothing's more important to these people than their God and their virginity. And honestly, the irony of it all is that neither of those things exist. Virginity doesn't exist. And their God doesn't exist either. They're basically killing each other over a myth. So it's like killing someone over believing that Mickey Mouse exists. I grew up in religion. Churches split over the translation they use Sunday morning. Churches have split that I've attended because one person is too Calvinistic or Arminian. Believing in the same God does not mean you're on the same page. And if you want to be taken seriously, don't have 40,000 denominations and hundreds of biblical translations. There is no unity in Christianity. And if they could fake it long enough to be called unified, it's usually against a group of people who are already persecuted. The only united front I have ever seen in religion is about hate. You look at Trump supporters. They all, and when I say all, most of them believe in God, country, and racism. You cannot vote for political parties and white ideologies without being a racist. I don't even think it's possible to be a loyal Republican and not be racist. Because you look at what Republican politics and Republican politicians stand for. Family values. Family values erases the concept that about 20% of the world's population isn't straight. Rampant homophobia, sexism, utter depravity. They believe in racism. If you are a loyal Republican, I don't know how you cannot be a racist. If you believe in the God of the Bible, you inherently believe that women are inferior to men. That is the definition of sexism. There is not one part of Christianity that isn't racist. I still nominate Mormons, the LDS, the Church of Latter-day Saints, as the most racist denomination of Christianity. I mean, you cannot get any more racist than believing that African American people or non-white people turn white upon death. They all, the missionaries wear white shirts. And when you understand what they believe in, you can't be any more racist than wearing white shirts. And religion is all about racism. I mean, I don't know where I heard it, but it's very true. People who read the Bible and understand what they're reading, they stop being a Christian. You cannot have compassion, empathy, with cognitive capability, read the Bible, understand what genocide and infantilization is, and still want to be a Christian once you read the Bible. I don't care what God says it, what man of God says it. If you believe you can kill and take somebody's land because you have a moral right to something, you're no better than Hitler. Because Hitler used God's name to take over Poland. Nobody has a right to anything unless they buy it, trade for it, or they inherit it. And by inherit, I mean they legally inherit it. They don't just believe they have a divine right to it. And the ironic part is, if it wasn't a white person doing it, the Christians would lose their freaking minds. If a person with brown, yellow, any color of skin but white said out loud and acted in a way that made it clear that they thought they had a divine right to something because their God or their birthright said so, we would call them terrorists. If a Muslim, and when I'm talking about a Muslim, I mean not just a Muslim, a religious extremist, believed that their God gave them an inheritance to take away land that the Jews just happened to be sitting on, white people would call that person a terrorist. And yet, when white people believe that the Jews were given an inheritance that they can legally take by dropping bombs, or depending on what part of the Bible you're reading, kill people with swords. That's not terrorism. That's the manifest destiny. they have different words for events and situations due to the color pigment of the people doing it. If a Muslim did what the ancient Jews did, we would call them terrorists. If the indigenous people that used to be called Indians by racist white men, if they tried to take land from white people or from Mexicans due to something their great spirit said, we would label them terrorists. But if a white person does it, it's just God's will. I'm sure that's what the 12 plus terrorists thought on 9/11. Their God told them to aim their little aircraft near a giant skyscraper. You can dress up terrorism, you can dress up white supremacy or the opposite of Islamophobia and say it's okay, it's moral, it's decent, but it's not. When you change the word you use to describe something based on the person who did its racial background and color pigment, we're going to have a problem. If you can't call what white men did in America genocide, but you call it manifest destiny, you are a racist. There's a difference between not knowing any better because you grew up in a homeschool program or you grew up in Florida where people are taught there are no gay people, than knowing about it and making excuses. And sure, you can be a racist and not know any better. Because I read a statistic. The more educated you are, the more knowledge and life experience and travel you've done, the less likely you will be a Republican or want to live in certain places where racists usually live, even though racists live everywhere. There's one in the White House. But it is a fact. I mean, they've done tests. They've done scientific exploration. The groups with the lowest IQ, the most hatred, racism, are Trump supporters. And they have several things in common. Lack of empathy, some form of psychosis, psychopathy, and a lack of compassion. And for those who don't know what psychopathy is the mental, some people would call it a mental illness, others call it a lack. Psychopathy is what psychopaths suffer from. They have muted or their empathy just doesn't look and act like normal people's. Think of people like Dexter or Ted Bundy. These are the kind of people I'm talking about. And in America, we have a racist problem. For a country that was founded, colonized, even though I don't enjoy knowing about how this country was colonized due to genocide and just deep hatred for anyone who wasn't white. Our country was founded, explored, and colonized by all kinds of people over hundreds of years. People who come to America in 2026 are just as courageous and welcome. At least they should be welcomed, not all the time are they. But in theory, people who immigrate in 2026, I mean, hopefully they do it the legal way, but we don't live in a perfect society. But anyone who comes to America today, they're just as courageous and they have as much to gain and lose as anybody who showed up here in 1620. Just because they don't have a 50% chance of dying crossing an ocean in a small boat doesn't make them any less courageous. For a group of people, Americans, to view anybody that isn't white as a individual that needs to be profiled. Nobody should have to prove citizenship. We live in a society where we should view everyone who's here as a citizen until they say they're just visiting. I lived in LA, and in my opinion, English is not the primary language. It's kind of like Florida. There are almost 1 million people in the largest city in Florida, which I think is the grossest city. That's not me saying it. It was actually, Jacksonville was voted a few summers ago as the ugliest place to spend your summers, so that's not just my opinion. But in America, we've forgotten that our country was colonialized by people of all pigments. That is why we have the Statue of Liberty. I mean, the Statue of Liberty, there's a poem written about bring me your tire, your poor. It doesn't say white anywhere, even though the woman that the Statue of Liberty looks like is probably a Caucasian woman. I'm pretty sure, because it was made by French people, and French people, it was probably patterned after a white woman who sat for the construction. But even then, if America was only colonialized by white people, that we would lose so much in our country. I actually looked up last week what different ethnicities have created in America. The world would be a very sad and much more boring place if everyone was the same pigment color. I looked up what inventions have African American people created. I came up with some very interesting ones. Ironing board, mailbox, and microphone. So every time some racist podcaster talking on YouTube is hating on African American people, he needs to remember that the microphone he's speaking into was created and invented by the people he's dissing. Every time you get mail in a mailbox, thank some very skilled, knowledgeable, clever African American person who created a mailbox. During St. Patrick's Day, I actually Googled a few things that Irish people have invented. The submarine I didn't know that an Irish scientist created and invented the submarine. Several types of needles we use for surgeries or to help people remain safe and healthy were invented by Irish scientists. And if you do a Google search of different kinds of inventions and historical discoveries done, there's a very good chance it wasn't a white man. We in this country have a racism problem. It shouldn't matter what race, what ethnicity somebody is initially. We should make a big deal when minorities win awards, when there's more visibility, because it's harder and they have to work harder. They have to work twice as hard as a white man to get the same notice white men take for granted. Being a woman is hard in certain careers because they don't get the acknowledgement they deserve. I mean, you look at Marie Curie, the Polish scientist. She almost didn't receive a Nobel Prize because at that time they had never gifted it to a woman. Her husband had to turn down several awards and threatened to walk if they didn't honor her too, because he considered her to be the primary scientist and discoverer, and he was secondary, which is a rather rare thing for a male of white distinction to do. Of course, their discovery later killed them due to radiation, but it's hard for women and people who don't fit into the white stereotype in any career to get the acknowledgement they deserve. When Obama became president, to this day, he's the only non-white president who's ever been in the Oval Office. That is an achievement. In 250 years, there has not been one non-white person besides him we trusted enough or were desperate enough to vote for. We've had several attempts to have a female vice president or a female president, and we just barely got one. We missed out on Vice President Harris being an amazing president. She probably wouldn't have been in the top 10 presidents, but just having a qualified woman of color be in the White House would have been a giant step forward for non-white people and for women. Women, by and large, are lucky enough to make it on the Supreme Court or be a senator or a representative. We're like the only world power that has never had a female commander-in-chief. If that doesn't tell you how racist our country is, I don't know what will. And people say, well, there hasn't been a qualified woman. Yes, there has. Because when you look at the types of men we've elected at the same time we could have elected a woman, it's disturbing. And sure, Hillary Clinton may not have been the best candidate to be the first woman president, but look at the person we elected instead. It's disturbing. We elected a adjudicated rapist, a multi-felon, over a woman who could not do any worse than he's done. And I'm pretty sure she would have jumped well over the barrier of being a decent, kind, respectable leader. She would not have been an embarrassment to America. The only embarrassment she would have been is that a woman was in charge of a white, racist people who see a woman being in charge as a judgment from God, which is stupid. If you view women that way, you're a danger to women. Safe men who can be around women because they're safe, kind, and they fight for women's rights, don't see a woman being in charge as a judgment, as a lack of morality. They see it as a benefit. Because historically, anytime a woman is in charge, we reach the pinnacle of world and domestic achievement. You look, both Elizabeth I and II, Victoria, Mary Queen of Scots, Margaret Thatcher, Catherine the Great. Anytime a woman's in charge, 9 out of 10 times, whatever country they rule or govern over become the pinnacle of world power. That's not to say it never happens when a man's in charge, but there's a reason why they've named giant times in history after women. You look at the most famous paintings, playwrights, giant leaps forward in scientific discovery. they usually fall under time periods when women were in charge. Any group of people that view women or non-white men in charge as a judgment from God are the kind of people we need to keep away from our kids. And anyone who stands for family values and supports a man who there are pictures of him touching 13-year-old girls, that's not a political party I want anything to do with. And nowadays, based on the family values of the Republican Party, when they say we're family values, we believe in the traditional family, I don't think of a nuclear family. I think of men who like kids too much. And the nuclear family was designed in the 1950s. It's not an old institution. Biblical marriage, the concept of biblical marriage isn't even 200 years old. Biblical marriage is a very new thing. I mean, you look at marriage in its specifics. The traditions of a wedding are not very old. The white dress didn't even become fashion until 1840. So all these traditions we talk about, how it's been around forever, it hasn't. Most of the traditions we view as sacred, godly, and moral haven't been around 300 years. Biblical marriage does not exist. Because if you read the Bible, biblical marriage is polygamy. Biblical marriage is between one man of privilege and as many wives, concubines, and male slaves as possible. Nowhere in the Bible does it condemn polygamy. I think the only times God in the Bible ever condemned multiple wives was if the wives took the husband's attention off God. You look at Solomon. The only time God hated Solomon's wives was when they turned Solomon away from God. If you have 500 wives and they do not take your attention off God nor get you involved in idolatry, I do not think their God would have a problem. There's no such thing as biblical values, biblical marriage, or family values. It is a fraud. Biblical marriage is a fraud. Biblical marriage is what the FLDS does, polygamy. And you look at the historical ramifications of all of this. Biblical marriage is when a man in his 40s marries a 12-year-old girl. That's biblical marriage. That is Mary and Joseph to a T. And anyone who thinks Mary was 16 when she gave birth to Jesus doesn't understand historical concept. There is no way a girl was 16 and unmarried at that time of history. Not a chance. When you actually understand what the Bible teaches and what it doesn't, you realize that when a white man talks about God, most of the time he does not know what he's talking about. These Christian apologetics, these Christian preachers who lends their mouths and ears to Trump as political advisors, they should not be talking at all about morality because most of them have been married multiple times. Sometimes their current wife is their adulterer partner. I mean, Ronald Reagan, he was married to a woman he had an affair with, who later became the First Lady. So when you understand that family values is a fraud, you shouldn't take anything these assholes say seriously. And every week, some person gets outed in some way, if you're a Republican, for having a secret life. I mean, this week was Joe Duggar. And half of the religious, conservative pastors or religious advisors Trump has been arrested, convicted, imprisoned, or accused of crimes against children or vulnerable women. Why does this not surprise me? Well, Aristotle used to say, birds of a feather flock together. Rapists like to spend time with other rapists. That is why Epstein liked to be around Trump and vice versa. That's what they do. Anytime Trump appoints somebody or thinks highly of somebody, I just automatically think they're a rapist. And so far I have not been surprised when they're later found out to be one. I grew up in an environment that still to this day believes if a man is cis, heterosexual, white, wears a suit, and calls himself a believer in God, he must be a decent person. Honestly, if you are wearing a suit, I trust you less. And if you're spouting things like family values, protect the family, men should be in charge, I view you as a threat. Because half the time, somebody's probably going to be arresting you in your near future, and it's not for unpaid parking tickets. I would say the worst sexual freaks on the planet are repressed conservatives. I kid you not. It's the quiet, morally repressed people that turn out to visit hustlers the most. I would say I'm shocked, but I'm not. The more repressed, the more straight you are in conservative circles. I would bet my life you're on Grindr. And if you support Charlie Kirk, you probably crashed Grindr. You probably did. And these people might fool my family because they're ignorant and racist, but they're not fooling me. I believe in many things, but if you call yourself a Christian, I'm keeping you from my kids. So imagine growing up in that environment where everyone I knew believed that Christians were being persecuted. Christians, white, cis, heterosexual Christians who belong to 4 of the most privileged, stuck-up, insensitive, lacking any form of empathy, especially Baptists, because they are historically known for showing the least amount of compassion to pregnant women. I mean, there's a reason why Westboro Church is known as Westboro Baptist Church. And they're the group of people most likely to stand outside of a gay person's funeral that was the victim of a hate crime than any other group of people. That environment I was raised is so filled with hate, intolerance, bigotry, lust. And when I mean lust, I'm not talking about what Christians call. I'm talking about a insidious, egregious form of greed. They use words like lust to create a situation where people become their own victims. This is what religion does. They create a problem that does not exist and offer a cure. You look at the 7 deadly sins. And for those who've been to church services for years or their entire lives, you could probably guess which of the 7 deadly sins Christians preach most about. There's very few sermons about gluttony, even though I remember at least 3 times in 30 years having that sermon. You will hear probably 100 times more about pride because it has to do with Satan or being queer. Anything having to do with sexual immorality or homosexuality will be targeted at least 1,000 times more likely. Because there's a hierarchy when it comes to moral sins of Christians. And one of the big ones that was not big when I was a child, empathy. Or in this case, the absence of empathy. I honestly believe most Christians fell asleep during Sunday school because that's the only way I can understand how Christians, especially Trump supporters, believe that empathy is a sin. But if you believe in Jesus, you have to have empathy. You cannot call yourself a Jesus follower without empathy. Because I don't know of anyone in the Bible more empathetic, kind, accepting, loving than Jesus. Even though he had his problems, he taught his followers that empathy was a sign of being a decent, moral, godly person. Anyone who does not like empathy or tells you not to have empathy should be your first clue they don't know Jesus. And when pastors who have offered spiritual advice, political affiliation, preach that it's a Christian sin to show empathy toward people who are being arrested, killed in detention centers, giving money to the poor is seen as a sin because it requires empathy to do those things. You cannot call yourself a follower of Jesus and teach people not to have empathy or to have a lack of empathy. Do you know what they call people who lack empathy? Psychopaths. Ted Bundy, to a T. People who score low on empathy, compassion, kindness, those are most likely to be Trump supporters, according to scientific statistics and medically held tests. In 10 years, they've done medical and scientific studies on people who identify as Trump supporters and conservatives. And I went into earlier that you have to score high. The lack of empathy, the lack of compassion, the limited education, the lack of secondary education, the racism. To be a Trump supporter, you have to lack basic traits of humanity. And in my opinion, anyone who lacks empathy, compassion, and says things like family values should be kept as far away from children as possible, as far away from vulnerable women as possible. Half the women on the planet that identify as Americans, half of those women uphold the patriarchy. They don't know any better. That doesn't make it okay, and it's not excusable. But when you're taught from the cradle that your role is to be secondary, less than, that your existence is a problem that all men have to endure, what do you expect those women to do? They don't know anything else. They are so conditioned not to get educated, not to gain their own thoughts, because they're still living in a 1950s reality. That's why they're called trad wives. When you are taught from the cradle that your inner voice, your gut, is the devil, that you cannot trust anything that's told or said to you outside of the religious leaders of your group, you are conditioned to view any opinion that violates your narrow, sexist, homophobic views as a threat to your soul. So when women voted for Trump, who classify themselves as religiously Christian, these are the kind of women that vote that way. They believe that they would be in an act of open rebellion voting for anything a white male of privilege says not to vote for. There is a hierarchy. And it's never in a woman's favor. Never. It has never been in a woman's favor to protect the patriarchy. Because women of white distinction believe in Christian environments that if you go against the patriarchy, you go against male leadership, you're going against God. There's a reason why Christians view God as a masculine entity. Why, when God talks, he has the authority of a man. And it's so ingrained in women of white color, and even in women of color. Some of the most loyal Christian women are women of color. That's why a lot of women of color voted for Trump. Christianity was used to indoctrinate slaves. Interesting fact. White men made it illegal for slaves to read, because the more educated somebody is, the less likely they're going to put up with your crap. That's why women who have a college degree minimum initiate 70% of divorces. When you know there's better, when you have resources to find something better, you mostly don't put up with less. That's why the men in charge right now, and even in religious environments, don't want women to be educated, don't like feminism, and can't endure women having resources, which is why they don't want abortion, feminism, equality, Black Lives Matter to happen, because they would lose their influence, power, and their privilege. Christianity was used to make slaves believe it was God's will to be enslaved. That's why Christianity has always supported things like anti-abortion, sexism, the Ku Klux Klan. Nobody champions racism and racist hate groups like Christianity. I actually looked. There is a list of all the hate crimes active in America or in American history. 9 out of 10 books on my parents' shelf were written by pastors or from churches that are considered hate groups. Think about it. On my parents' religious bookshelf, or bookshelves, because they have a lot of them, 9 out of 10 on that religious bookshelf library, 90% are written by people or written by people in churches that are on the hate group list. White supremacy is such a problem in Christianity. You can't get past it. There's a reason why every picture you see of Jesus is a white man. If you can get to kids early about the supremacy of white men being God, you can teach them anything. And I attended a class. What skin pigment would Jesus most likely to have? Well, during the time, the history, the location, the information provided, Jesus would most likely be olive skin or black. I was taught my entire life he had olive skin, but there is a very good chance he could have been black. And yet, when you mention that to Christians, not one Christian have I ever mentioned that to would ever say it was possible. They would immediately shut it down. The idea that Jesus could be black would be an egregious sin to them because they don't view black people not be offensive if he was. Think about that. Imagine having such a low opinion of African American people that the idea that Jesus might have been black is a nightmare for you. So, yeah, there's always that. That's why when somebody tells me something, I immediately put it on hold and research it to make sure that what they're telling me isn't utter bullshit. And if it came out of Abaca, Pensacola, Florida, or out of any mouth associated with Christianity, it's probably bullshit. I don't trust what's told to me for several reasons. When medical and scientific statistics only matter to Christians, when it supports their agenda, but they utterly ignore it, change it, or delete it if it doesn't, I'm not going to believe what they say, period. Unless it lines up with evidence that can be backed by places like Johns Hopkins or the Board of Medicine. It's always that kind of thing. When the group of people you grow up in discount the expert minds of whatever specialty or topic we're talking about, and instead only use whatever it is when it agrees with you and makes you morally superior, you're not a good person. You're just not. People of integrity would use statistics even if it goes against what they believe. Hopefully they change what they believe, but because how can you believe something if it's not backed by science and consistent data? I mean, that's why we believe in gravity, because we proved it. And that's the whole difference. When you grow up in an environment that sees science, medicine, mathematics as a threat, if it contradicts your beliefs, that's not critical thinking. That's narrow-minded view. My lack of religious beliefs, the things I hold as fact, is because they've been proven. I believe in gravity, the laws of thermodynamics, all of the things that Nobel Prizes have been won due to discoveries. But if at any time anything I believe in has been proven to not be factually accurate, as long as the evidence given to me proves something better, I'll immediately change how I view it. That's the difference between organized religion and critical thinking. One group will not change what they believe, even if it's backed by science. While critical thinkers, like myself, will change what they believe, what they deem is true, because they have more knowledge of something. And that's the whole problem. When you view science as a threat, feminism as a threat, you have a problem. And let's get this off the table. Men of privilege who see biblical marriage as a sacred thing, they really don't. Because most of these people, most of these privileged white men who view biblical marriage as God's gift to man and manliness, they're seeing hookers. They're paying hustlers. They're cheating on their wives. People like Trump. Yeah. Jimmy Swagger. These are the kind of people that believe in biblical values. There are no biblical values. You can't get biblical values from a book that says genocide is okay. You cannot say rape and assault is wrong, but then support Trump. The Bible teaches fathers the legal Jewish way to sell their daughters into sex slavery. Christianity is not a moral religion. They just dress it up like it's moral, but that's not the same thing. I honestly believe that most people who have compassion and empathy would stop being Christians if they actually read the Bible with critical thinking. But critical thinking just isn't something that's allowed in Christianity. Think about it. If women suddenly got the idea that they weren't inferior and that they could trust their gut, the patriarchy would probably die in 100 years. But it won't, and it can't, because the patriarchy survives on fear and doubting yourself. It's basically a hostage situation with the Stockholm Syndrome.